Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode in our Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts series. In this episode, we see part 2 of The Enforcer, Stanley Smith, and the A-Team's final years. In the last episode, we ended on a sad note. Stan's son, Stan Jr., had been battling an addiction to heroin, which had him in its grips for 2 years before Stan Jr. eventually has an overdose and dies. Clive Small, former police commissioner for New South Wales, said that Stan did everything he could to try and get Stan Jr. off the drugs, sending him to rehabilitation centres as well as using their Whale Beach home as a kind of jail for his son, keeping him locked up at one point. However, somehow Stan Jr. was able to get out or get hold of heroin, and it was his last hit. Their family would have been distraught. It is believed that Stan tracked down a drug dealer on the North Shore who he believed had sold Stan Jr. the drugs, and it is alleged, but was never proven, that Stan lured this drug dealer to a particular spot on the premise of buying drugs from him. When the dealer arrived, Stan beat the life out of him in an emotional rage. When he finished beating him, it is alleged he got into his car and ran the dealer's body over repeatedly, running him over and then backing the car over him again, and doing this several times until he got his rage out. It is unknown whether the A-Team was part of this or not. They may have left it to Stan, as this was a very personal matter, which he may have had to deal with on his own. The murder was never solved, but many believe it to have been Stan. It was a terrible thing for the family to have dealt with, as Stan Jr. was only 21. His 2 younger brothers, Hayden and Peter, must have really felt it hard. This too may have been the reason for Stan's change later on. It is quite sad. Could Stan's life of crime and dealing in drugs have led to his son's addictions? Many would say yes. Perhaps this led to Stan eventually getting out of the drug business. But it would be a little while yet, and a few more murders. Stan was mad. Now, we know from the previous episodes that the A-Team were all in for each other, especially when it came to murder, knocking out the competition as well as those who threatened them. Some hits for revenge too. There were so many deaths in these Sydney gangland wars, and many believed Stan was responsible for several of them. However, he was never arrested for murder. The police at the time were sure he did the majority of the hits, but they could never prove it. He was involved in phone tapping throughout the 70s and the 80s, which put a bit of a spanner in the work, especially when he was trying to help out associates from being thrown in jail, such as his controversial conversations with murder victim Anthony Spaghetti Tony Eustace. In 1983, Tony was assisting Stan in trying to get fellow drug dealer Andrew Stathis out of trouble with the law. Tony was an English-born drug dealer, originally from the Liverpool area, who moved to Australia in the 1970s. It was also reported that he was an associate of Terry Clark in the Mr. Asia drug syndicate. He ran a Tony's Bar and Grill in Double Bay and was a suspect in the murders of 25-year-old model and drug courier Maria Hishin, who was killed in 1975, and another drug dealer, 29-year-old courier Catherine Dale Payne, killed in 1978. Phone taps heard how a lady friend, Palmer Strawbridge of Tony's, was looking for more money to expand her boutique business. She had a close relationship with High Court Judge Lionel Murphy. Now, Stathis had been arrested in connection with a $60 million marijuana plantation near Cowra. Could it have been one of Stan's, or was he just one of Stan's distributors? The phone taps recorded Eustace going backwards and forwards between Stan Smith and this Palmer Strawbridge. Strawbridge was getting in close with High Court Judge Lionel Murphy, and he was trying to work Paul Lander, the new Attorney General. In a strange turn of events, Palmer actually has a party in which Tony Eustace, as well as Judge Lionel Murphy, are at this party and conversing about getting Stathis off the charges. It was an awkward conversation had later on the phone between Eustace and Strawbridge about how Lionel Murphy wouldn't really open up at the party. Well, could you blame him? He's a High Court judge. But he seems to pop by to Tony's restaurants, and they continue talks there. Now, it is strange that eventually Andrew Stathis gets bail of $20,000, which is paid, but in turn he flees and goes to Greece, meeting up with Aussie Bob, who was also on the run. One thing in organised crime is that you don't know when your ticket will be up. You can fight all you like, but you still may end up dead. And that's what happened to many of these players. Within 2 years, many of them wouldn't be alive. Now, it is not understood what actually happened, but Tony Eustace ends up dead, and everyone believes that it's Chris Flannery who's pulled the trigger. It was believed it was April 23rd, 1985. Eustace was shot 6 times outside the Airport Hilton in North Arncliffe. He was found by 2 children on their way home from sports training around 7, laying beside his gold Mercedes and bleeding out. He was rushed to hospital, and when police attempted to get information about his killer, he promptly told them to fuck off and died shortly afterwards from his wounds around 5 hours after being shot. Now, it's suspected that George Freeman requested that Chris Flannery kill Eustace due to him being a heroin supplier to Nettie Smith, which is quite interesting. If he was involved in heroin, why was Stan involved with him? Perhaps this is why events lead to Flannery's disappearance later on. After all, Eustace was helping Stan, and Stan's part of the A-team. But it was all for naught, because later on Stathis ends up getting pinched at an airport with drugs in Greece. And nothing really comes from an investigation put into this phone tapping on High Court Judge Lionel Murphy. He ends up with cancer and dies in 1986. The inquiry into the conduct of Lionel Murphy was closed down shortly before he died. And Paul Lander, who was the one to bring about the inquiry, actually died back in 1984. So we have the phone taps in 83, Paul Lander dies in 84. We've got Eustace being murdered in 85, Chris Flannery disappearing in 1985 shortly afterwards, and then Lionel Murphy dying in 86. It's amazing how many of them were dead within a couple of years. It certainly was a crazy time. But Stan got what he wanted. At the time, Andrew Stathis fled, and he wasn't put behind bars. Well, not until 1987. But Stan did give him a bit of extra time. 4 years. Clive Small says, there were many similarities too between the hits on Stuart John Reagan and that of the 1985 disappearance of Chris Flannery, aka Rent-A-Kill. They both had big mouths on them. They were both loose cannons. Both were affecting the A-team negatively. They had to be stopped. The details around Chris Flannery's murder or disappearance are sketchy at best. Accounts from his wife Kathleen and fellow underworld figure friend Nettie Smith believe it was the police who knocked off Chris, possibly at the request of Roger Rogerson, the corrupt cop, or was it at the request of the A-team? Wife Kathleen stated that George Freeman phoned Chris to come and look at a new gun he'd acquired. But when he couldn't start his car, he raced back upstairs and called George, who asked him to get a taxi. Now, Nettie Smith, who apparently cited this, stated he cited Chris Flannery getting into a car with undercover cops that he knew. And then further down the street, 2 more cops got in on either side to prevent Flannery from getting out. The story from police was that he got into a taxi and they tracked down the taxi driver who stated he dropped him at the airport. What really happened to him is a mystery. But we'll look at that in a later episode dedicated to Chris Flannery. The police believe that Stan was the hitman, doing his duty for the A-team. Things travelled along as they had for 3 decades until the shock exit of his A-team buddy George Freeman. He had had health problems, but at only 55, no one expected him to die. Stan and Lennie saw off their buddy at his funeral, and not long after that, Lennie is in trouble with the law. He's pulled in and eventually behind bars. During this time, Stan would have done anything he could for Lennie while incarcerated, but the days of help from police and politicians was over, and Lennie died behind bars. Although the past decade Stan has been running his own race, the days of being a standover were left behind. Since teaming up with Lori McLean, his marijuana growing, importing and distribution business was booming. Despite a few raids here and there on other members of the outfit, Stan had remained clean and able to carry on. Stan may have been a brutal killer early on, but he had the brains and knew how to use them, which kept him alive and happy. But it couldn't last forever. By 1996, they had trouble selling their stocks in Australia, as the amount of Aussie growers and people importing cannabis into Australia was at an all-time high. The market was flooded. Stan complained to his partner Lori McLean that they needed to stop importing cannabis at this stage and import cocaine, which at that time there was currently a drought and demand was high. They had both agreed in the beginning of their partnership not to deal in heroin, due to Stan losing his eldest son. They honoured this agreement for the 20 years they were in business together. Cocaine was different in Stan's mind, but Lori McLean did not want to deal with cocaine. He would only import cannabis, and so they stayed the course. Sadly though, in March of 1997, the federal police, who had a keen eye on Lori McLean, found out about the shipment and seized it. Lori McLean was arrested and his assets frozen. He was worth about $110 million at this time. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to import large amounts of cannabis and to money laundering, to which, when raiding his home and offices, found a lot of money hidden away, tucked away in different places, and with other associates. So they'd been really doing well the past decade. Lori McLean received 16 years, but was out in 7. He retired from the life and managed to keep a lot of his money, moving to Melbourne. Stan, however, was really lucky that he wasn't jailed in connection with this. He moved away from the drug scene at this time, probably realising how lucky he was and how close he came to being put in jail himself, but decides to just live off the money that he's invested in property as well as a couple of nightclubs that he owns. Soon, though, he decides it's time to leave the crooked life once and for all. In 2003, he joins the Evangelical Christian Church in Sydney in an effort to right the wrongs he had done in his life. In 2004, he is baptised, which is a special moment for him.
Good morning to everybody. My name is Stanley Smith. I'm 67 years old. I'm very pleased to be baptised. It means a lot to me. And it's simply committed by me to take the Lord. Christ is my Saviour. And my brother and wife. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth and the life. Now there's the fellowship by me.
In his last years, he really turned over a new leaf, working with various welfare groups in the Old Docks area and assisting feeding the poor. He started running legitimate businesses and attending religious gatherings regularly, such as Bible studies, and he also did leaflet drops for the church. Perhaps he believed that doing good deeds may give his soul a chance for redemption. Many would debate that. Could a life of violence and murder be absolved in the last 10 years of one's life? God knows. Well, at least he did turn things around. Stan died at home at the age of 73, still with Marilyn, his lifelong partner. It is not mentioned from what he died of. It's possible that a life such as his, so hardcore, his heart gave out earlier perhaps than it would have had he led a normal life without the adrenaline. But 73 years old is pretty good for the world's, well, maybe not the world's, but Australia's most violent hitman, as he was known for quite a good chunk of his life. At the funeral, Marilyn, his lifelong love, was there, as well as his two youngest sons, Hayden and Peter. He was also outlived by his mother, who was 90. There were other colourful characters at the funeral, including Carl Burnett, and others he hung out with just before his end, including Graham Abbo Henry, who turned over a new leaf himself, possibly thanks to Stan the Man Smith. But Stan had an interesting life, longer than most in his field. He outlived the other members of the A-Team, and that's why we have him last. Well, that's the A-Team, the three men that stuck together, who came up from terrible beginnings to become ruthless members of organised crime. They stuck together through thick and thin, right to the end. But don't despair, there's many more to come. So if you're enjoying these episodes, don't forget to give them a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we're posting up more of the top Australian figures in organised crime.
2 or 3 times a day, and he was telling McPherson about the problem he's been having with his column. And Lennie was telling him about how he'd make a point every morning of getting up and having his shit before I do anything else through the day. Stan agrees with him and says, yeah, it's important to have a fucking shit every day. And then Lennie said something along the lines of, yeah, look, that's right, Stan. He said, Stan? He said, you call me Stan on the phone? How many times have I got to fucking tell you, you fucking dog, you imbecile? Don't call me that on the telephone. And he slammed the phone down. Because we're sitting back listening to this conversation, pissing ourselves laughing, it was just so funny. And it gave him insight into these two individuals. After about 5 minutes, Stan rings Lennie back. Listen, I'm sorry, mate. Sorry about the way I spoke to you. That's okay, Stan. There you fucking go again, you fucking idiot. You fucking imbecile, you stupid cunt. Bang, the phone would go down again.